There are plenty of photos and videos from the early 20th century when American skyscrapers were being built. Moreover, we've already come across the strange fact that the sturdiest massive buildings from the pre-flood era were demolished and replaced with new taller ones. They aimed to surpass the 19th century, but it was actually earlier eras like the 18th and 17th centuries. It also becomes clear that by the end of the 19th century, construction technology was in its infancy, and now we'll try to prove that. News from Alexia Gribkov. An exciting photograph from 1932 lunch atop a New York skyscraper construction, workers having lunch on a beam. This is the famous photo of workers supposedly building the first skyscrapers in New York. Why is this photo a fake? The editing was done a long time ago and the quality is not computer generated. If you look at the workers' feet, you can see that they are sitting on a beam that is lying on the ground, and their feet are not hanging but are calmly resting on the invisible ground. There are white halos around their silhouettes from above. This was whitened to hide the overlay on the landscape. It's a kind of 19th century Photoshop. Besides, where are their belongings, lunchboxes, bags? After all, some have already eaten and others are still eating. If you look closely at this photograph, you can find a lot of artifacts and you don't need to be an expert to do so. This photograph was presented as a staged publicity stunt for Rockefeller Center. As Corbis Ken Johnson from The Independent testified, it seems quite clear that they were real workers. The indelible image was first published on October 2, 1932 in the New York Herald Tribune. This photo has never been attributed to any specific person. Corbis hired a private detective to try to discover the identities of the 11 people in the photograph, but without success. So with this photograph we have a typical fake, which is what most stories are made of. All nations are susceptible to mystification and collective self-deception, so much so that an outside observer can judge the level of infantilism from these examples. I have repeatedly come across reports in the media that certain centers commission special studies on the degree of this infantilization. Before another social experiment about the stupidity of Russians, as they say, there are, or rather, deliberately created legends. But I think for several hundred years now, there has been an entire industry dedicated to dumbing down the population. It all starts with instilling belief in things that can't be verified and eventually leads to a state of unconditional acceptance of whatever needs to be implanted into a person's mind. There are countless such programs, and the American people are no exception. Every time I watch staged American fights, I'm puzzled. How can fans be so genuinely invested while watching these dances? All these fights are clearly choreographed. One wrong move can lead to injury, cripple the actor, or even kill them. Anyone who has ever been in a fight or practiced martial arts knows how an accidental blow can knock someone out and cause injury. And here, 130-kilogram men supposedly jump on each other with their full weight like wind-up mechanical rabbits, and yet they don't break any bones. Anyone would agree that these fights are just trickery and cheating, and such shows don't appeal to Russians. People aren't that suggestible to even conditionally believe in such a performance. But Americans don't have a problem with that. That's exactly why they won't doubt a story that's so obviously fabricated. After the film about 19th century riveting aired, much debate followed. Many Russian riveters, experts in the process, exposed the author as an amateur lacking technical understanding. Footage was found on the internet showing how easily American workers could handle rivets. Here they heat up the rivet, and one skilled worker throws the red-hot rivet to another skilled worker who, having climbed to any height without safety gear, quickly inserts it where needed and rivets it in place. And here we encounter a certain local trust. Those who sent this video truly believe a riveter can climb 10 or even 50 meters and the 10,000th rivet will always reach him for him to catch and use where needed. At the same time, the believer doesn't even think about how to get the riveting machine up to any arbitrary height. What is the maximum allowable length and weight of the hoses supplying compressed air? A single bridge can have tens or even hundreds of thousands of rivets. And so, day after day, year after year, people tougher than any circus acrobats without any safety equipment in jackets and caps built America's skyscrapers. It would be very interesting to figure out how the holes for the rivets were drilled and how they always matched up, regardless of the expansion, stretching, and compression of the metal. The weather is different. Where are those old precision drilling systems? Of course, skyscrapers were being built and people were involved in that. Riveting was used. But the point is that the main construction technologies used in building the first skyscrapers and other large metal structures before the 20th century were not shown, and the tools are hidden. They were not replaced by officially recognized technologies until the 1930s. The 1930s construction process is already well documented. We can see cranes and welding here. The builders start wearing helmets, and you can see safety elements. But at the beginning of the 20th century, all these recordings look a lot like acrobatic performances meant to hide something, presenting an unprecedented achievement as the selfless acrobatic labor of hero patriots. We all love watching funny videos where people and animals slip and fall. In cartoons and movies, we don't find it strange that people are very agile and perform incredible stunts. But in reality, that's impossible. There are always factors that can be calculated. Palm moisture, grease on the beam, material weakness, slowed reaction due to a person's physical condition, miscalculation, or external influence. Then people and animals start dropping like bowling pins. With this approach, skyscrapers would see a dozen workers scraped off the asphalt daily. But we're supposed to believe that they were incredibly agile, and not a single one of these remarkable builders of the future empire was harmed. It's absolutely obvious that these so-called workers are none other than hired circus acrobats brought in for stage filming to legitimize the construction of skyscrapers at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. Because at that time there was neither sufficient metal production, nor advanced mechanical engineering, nor construction technology. And what needed to be hidden was the fact that all of this was done using the industrial base left from the previous civilization. That's why there's all this fuss about forgeries. At the very beginning of the 20th century, there was a civilizational legalization of the United States of America as an independent state, which supposedly built all the cities in North America from scratch. Many events were organized for this, already covered by alternative researchers. So what was the purpose of creating staged photos and videos of skyscraper construction? It's obvious that those who were introducing the new reality had doubts that people in the future would believe that the skyscrapers of those years were built by ordinary workers whose ancestors had only recently arrived from Europe, bringing their simple belongings in horse-drawn wagons. And so this gap between the lack of industry, technology and manufacturing at that time and the presence of a large number of already existing skyscrapers had to be bridged. The main goal of building large megalithic structures was to legitimize the pre-flood scale of construction. It wasn't necessary to destroy everything. The main goal was to shift attention to buildings that surpassed the structures of the previous era in scale. Don't assume this happened only in the United States of America. Legitimization was occurring worldwide. Buildings from the pre-flood era were attributed to local craftsmen who usually had nothing to do with their construction, and supposedly they invented the architecture themselves. But we see identical copies of buildings, temples, architectural elements and decorations on different continents. Technology is a complex thing. It's a whole set of tasks and solutions that are developed over decades and even centuries. They didn't yet exist in the new civilization then. and it took a lot of time and resources to extract technologies from the remaining sources. Why was it so hard? You could just read and create immediately. But first of all, to just take and do it, you needed a ready metallurgical industry, chemical agriculture to feed this industry, and a lot of other accompanying factors. And now we know that there was a shortage of people on Earth up until the second half of the 20th century. And then, in what language were the antediluvian technologies actually described? Maybe in Russian? As we know, the English measurement system isn't metric, and converting and standardizing it took time. And in general, what do we know about the media that the antediluvian civilization used? It would seem, of course, that it was in books, but that's just a stereotype. Now, we are discovering evidence of computer and other technologies from the antediluvian period. Here's another argument. Safety regulations in every industry are also a complex technology, developed over many generations and paid for with thousands of lives. These recordings show that in the early 20th century, it seems no one had heard of it. This also serves as evidence of the absence of other technologies at that time. That's why they chose to convince future generations that their ancestors were skillful, daring, and fearless of death or heights. That they easily built skyscrapers like these, jumping from beam to beam like monkeys. They slept on them, ate on them, and walked on them just as easily and freely as if they were on the ground. A Knight Templar of the early 20th century. Now, any Star Wars fan would say that this is, of course, a droid. This isn't chemical protection. There's no protection for the neck or respiratory system. Most likely this is radiation protection. Historians wouldn't be able to figure out where radiation could have come from in the early 20th century, even if you tried to stimulate them with a taser. Since we're already aware of the obvious theories about nuclear bombings of cities at that time, these protective measures simply had to exist. Yuri Timovsky showed perfectly in his video that San Francisco was destroyed in 1906 by a series of massive explosions, and it wasn't an earthquake or a fire. The event was planned and the stage filming was directed. These substitutions occurred worldwide. The massive deaths from radiation contamination were concealed by all possible means. More people died from the so-called Spanish flu than in World War I. During those years, newspapers recorded no information about the terrible flu. The event was invented and inserted into history later. Here, for example, is information from Wikipedia about the Second Battle of Ypres. In the photos and videos, we see a city destroyed by a series of powerful explosions, either nuclear or comparable in strength. But the text doesn't mention this at all, and the entire focus is on the fact that the Germans used 180 tons of chlorine. And when we look at the destruction of the city, we're somehow supposed to think that this destruction was caused by that chlorine. Or poisoned, people went mad and destroyed the city by hand in this way. Our 180 tons of chlorine is such an outrageous event that it's simply inappropriate to even ask about any kind of nuclear destruction. But it gets even more interesting. Wikipedia says that the chlorine cloud changed direction and moved back toward the Germans. And guess what saved the Germans? Attention, it was that they put on gauze masks. What a joke. You'd think that those who understand poisonous substances and protective equipment would be laughing their heads off, but for some reason that's not happening. No belly buttons were harmed. And even if Wikipedia wrote that the German troops, after stuffing themselves with mini-peas, launched a gas attack against the English, simultaneously destroying a city with a synchronized fart, there would probably be people who would try to oppose such blatant lies. Would you be outraged, or would you just accept it too? In general, there are serious doubts about historical accounts that say the Germans fought against the English, or that England fought against the United States of America. I have no doubt that the Anglo-Saxons and the Germans are all one big related family, and they would never seriously think of fighting against each other. United West forces, backed by external fire support, led all military actions against Rus. Decades later, these were labeled civil wars, and population losses in the millions were attributed to epidemics. Here's another example of the general zombification of the population, which allows falsifiers to carry out the most primitive manipulations, and not to waste time or resources trying to do it even somewhat skillfully just for decency's sake. I would call this the war of clones. The method for creating any battle scenes in paintings is like this. You take one person and the artist copies him in different poses, often without even bothering to change him in any way. Or, as I suppose most likely, the person was photographed in different poses and then copied onto the painting. As a rule, these paintings are presented as old, which is unlikely. Moreover, we see the universal application of this technology for all time periods and different continents. This suggests that the production of historical world paintings took place at the same time and in the same place, just like the historical video recordings of the 19th century. In this painting, next to the drawn clones of soldiers, we see modern photographs of black people taken from dance scenes. Such an obvious collage can only exist with complete brainwashing of the population, otherwise how could people accept this? And here the artist went out of his way and painted mustaches on the clone. He even drew a beard on one of them. And in some paintings we see that two different characters can be used for the clones. And this character has a big jaw. I would call this a major jaw attack of the clones. And here is a famous painting about Piotr I, where Piotr I himself is a clone of the other soldiers. And here it's the same thing. Here, one person makes up the entire army. He's an army all by himself. The same person. An interesting picture is forming. Imagine how one person becomes all the characters in a future famous painting. Someone was lucky enough to become famously unknown. Would you like to be in such a historical painting? Here the mustached men are going on the attack. The clones are landing on the enemy shore. All these paintings are well known, and I won't try to name them, and these clones look a bit like Alexei Kungurov. It's clear right away that they're all at least majors in rank. To be fair, Alexei has already made history even without this. And here's the famous painting Napoleon near Borodino. What a disgrace. He even brought an army of clones to Russia. But don't even think about doubting it. The Russians had something to counter the aggressor. They had their own army of their own clones. A platoon of Usachis and Opa. They even drew a beard on the last one. The quality of the pictures here ranges from downright sloppy to acceptable. This job is likely handed down through generations, offering someone a comfortable life. And this is what a real army should look like. No identical bodies, builds, or heights, unless it's the Chinese army, selected from a population of 1.5 billion. As we know, there were few people on Earth back then, so choices were limited. There's such a paradox in our history. Officially, since the late 19th century, photography and filmmaking were widespread, but all the key events are depicted only in paintings. Or, as we now discover, they were staged for the camera. This inevitably leads us to the fact that history was created after the fact, decades after the events took place, and the history we know never actually existed.